Hello and welcome to another Intersections podcast. My name is Alex Cunningham and I'm happy to introduce to you guys this wonderful new episode. This one's going to be a two-parter featuring the wonderful Dr. Richard Boyatzis, who is absolutely phenomenal when it comes to mindfulness at work. So without further ado, Prachin Kwan, take it away.
We are so excited to welcome Dr. Richard Boyatzis to this podcast today. He's been a huge inspiration for the work that I've been doing and the ways that we are thinking about mindfulness and innovation. So we're really pleased to have him. Thank you, Richard, for being here. Quick introduction. Dr. Boyatzis has been studying this topic of intentional change theory and complexity theory since 1967. And he's continued this research on how people and organizations engage in sustainable, desired change. He's a distinguished university professor at Case Western Reserve University, as well as a professor in the departments of organizational behavior, psychology, and cognitive science. He's won many awards at Case Western Reserve for his research and teaching and service. With that, thank you and welcome again. And we wanted to get started with just talking about your journey and what motivated you to get into this field.
From the time I was, 7, 8, or 9, I wanted to go into space. I wanted to be in the space field. And part of the problem was that in my early years, my parents had immigrated from the U.S. and I'm from Greece to the U.S. And during the early years, the public school systems tried to lead me back 3 times in New York City because I spoke with a Greek accent. I actually spoke Greek before I spoke English. And in 1950, that was considered a sign of retardation, not multiculturalism. All this is kind of rumbling around. And one of the times I get tested was after Sputnik went up. And they called my mother in and she said, later she told me she rolled her eyes when she saw the note. She said, "Oh, not another one of these battles." Because she would always go to battle for me and all this. Anyway, the testing showed that I was really good in math and physics. So I got into an experimental program where we did junior high school, and 2 years of college, all in the same time. I got into MIT, which was my first choice to study aeronautics and astronautics, and that's what I got my degree in. My specialty was control systems and interplanetary vehicles, but I ran out of money, so MIT got me a job doing the work as a rocket scientist engineer at Northrop Norway. So I went out there, and for a period of, from August to sometime in January, I worked. And if you did it, and you saved your money reasonably, you'd have enough to finish, which I did. But in the process, I discovered that the day-to-day work was boring. The Air Force Academy had tried to recruit me, but they had insisted that because of my eyes, I wouldn't be able to go into space. And the day-to-day work is basically you and a computer, and then occasionally you go in the lab and, fire off some engines and things like that. But it was very, very disappointing. So I'd worked in restaurants, like my father was a waiter, and every male I'd grown up with on this side of the Atlantic were Greek Americans, and they all went in, even my cousins went into the restaurant business. I didn't want to do that again. I'd worked a number of summers. I did a lot of music, and that's how I helped pay my way through MIT, but I didn't think I was good enough to really make it in that field. And even for a while there, because I was a very devout Greek Orthodox, I dabbled with becoming a priest and decided not to. So what I thought of is, I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop. We were 2 departments in the research group of Sheldons, if you follow Big Bang Theory.
Yeah.
And everybody was weird. Everybody was a geek. But we had different abilities of eye tracking and ability to make eye contact and things like that. But the managers got so little out of us. At MIT, they had a whole set of courses that didn't have prerequisites you could take in management. So I went to this presentation where the professors talk about their course. And one young fellow who was finishing his PhD at Harvard, didn't actually have it yet, David Kolb, who a lot of people know because of learning styles and experiential learning theory. Right. He was teaching a course in organizational psychology. And as he described it, I thought, what utter bull. This is absolutely ridiculous. But during his description, he said 2 words that were so powerful that I literally ran, because everything was capacity controlled. So I ran down to the basement classroom and I got into the course. And the two words were no tests. So
fascinating story.
Well, it takes me a long time to get to this story, but you have to have the context. And the reason it's so important is the entire path of my life was changed because I'm test phobic.
Mhm.
And, I don't like tests and I don't do well on them and all this kind of stuff. At any rate, it was in his class that I discovered I love this field, whatever it was.
Mhm.
And I told him I wanted to do my term paper on how managers didn't help their subordinates. He said, I've got some data on 30-year-olds in our master's program, their version of the MBA. I worked on the data. I mean, really spent many more hours than a normal person would on a term paper. He liked what I'd done. He offered me a summer job. We eventually published it. He got me into a whole bunch of PhD seminars at MIT. So all of a sudden, I was taking multiple seminars with Ed Schein, who I didn't know was a giant in the field, even in 1967. And he became one of my mentors, still is. I mean, I talked to him a few months ago. And Dave Kolb, of course, continued to be. And then he introduced me to Dave McClellan at Harvard.
Mhm.
And I was studying things like with Everett Hagen, I did 2 PhD courses on psychoanalytic history because he was one of the pioneers with Eric Erikson of the Psychoanalytic Society of Boston that helped Eric Erikson write books like Gandhi's Truth and Young Man Luther and all this. I discovered that this field of psychology was so exciting that I discovered something that I'd never seen before. I didn't know any adults who would work even if they weren't paid. I mean, look, my father loved what he did. He was very charming, very good at it. And a lot of the other folks, my uncles, my cousins, same thing. But all of them had some part of them that looked forward to retirement.
Right.
And I started to meet people that were different. They weren't Greek,
Mhm.
and they had these things called PhDs, and they did this stuff of research, but it wasn't space research. It was on and with people.
Yeah.
And that was it. And then Ed Schein and Dave Kolb and Dave McClellan and a few of these other folks at the time convinced me I should go for a PhD, not a master's, just right for a PhD, and that I should go in psychology, not in management. And they helped me get into Harvard. So
that's so cool.
And then when I was there, I was really, because of work I was doing with McClellan, although my thesis was on affiliation, on unconscious drives of intimacy, I was doing a lot. I joined him because he was in the kind of middle of this 15-year research sequence on power. And I picked up on the part of the effect of alcohol on aggression. I did some basic research on that. And then he had been challenged to come up with a therapy program because he claimed you could improve people. And he turned to me and said, hey, you're the one who actually understands how to work with people. Why don't you do it? So in 1970, I started doing psychotherapy under supervision, but I spent a good deal of time in the 70s doing clinical psychotherapy and training therapists on this while I was doing the competency research, because I'm credited with being one of the 5 people who started the competency movement in HR, which we now call emotional intelligence, but in those days it was just the competencies. And because McClellan and the others were all trained in the same arena, Ed Schein and Dave Kolb and I got our doctorates in the same program, just different years apart.
Right.
And Dave McClellan went into this department at Harvard because you had to do your doctoral work and your exams in cultural anthropology, in sociology, and social psychology, and then clinical personality. What I didn't know at the time, because I was new to the field, was that the people I was studying with in each of these 4 fields were the people who wrote the books that everybody read and cited even then, so it ends up being, just it was a marvelous experience. I turned down a faculty position at Yale that Richard Hackman offered me when I was finishing because it wasn't quite the position I wanted. And I didn't really want to teach. I wanted to do research and psychotherapy. And So I went to work for this research consulting company that I ended up a few years later running and growing, and did that until I had a midlife crisis and got tired of running researchers and consultants, and 1987 became a professor and haven't looked back since. So is that okay? So
That was
content
awesome.
wise,
Yeah.
I started studying how people helped each other or not in that first study in spring of 1967. By a year later, or a year and a half later, I was trying to pay my way through my doctoral program. In those days, when we graduated, those of us who did, we always had huge debts. I mean, I'm not belittling the power of the debts, but I got to say, when I do the inflation adjusted dollar amounts, I mean, when I graduated, I had the equivalent of 2 years of gross salary as my debt. So we all did. And meanwhile, we were all working our butts off while we were in the program. So one of the things I started doing was management training, which seemed a little odd. Here I was quite literally 21 or 22, and I'm doing executive development programs with executives at Monsanto and the American Baptist Home Mission Society and in a lot of education programs and all that. But what became the central theme of my life is, how do people change in sustainable, desired ways? Whether it's individual change or dyads, couples, or teams, or organizations, or communities, or countries. And that was where, because of my cognitive style and learning style, I like to get my hands into stuff, not just think about it. So it was really effective doing the executive leadership training and doing psychotherapy with alcoholics and drug addicts and doing the research on all these things. And that's where I started the meditation work, because teaching the alcoholics and the drug addicts to do basics of meditation was something I started in 1970. And then later I expanded to some other things like Tai Chi and all that. But in those days, we didn't know that it worked. We believed it would work. And unlike some of the fads, meditation and yoga, like prayer and exercise, like love and compassion, have turned out to really, and playfulness, have turned out to be, stood the test of time. They really do help.
Well, what a fascinating background. Thanks for sharing all of that. I don't think I knew all of that background, and what an amazing set of mentors that you have. I'm envious. So thank you. You had shared your paper when we first got in touch entitled Thrive and Survive, Assessing Personal Sustainability.
Right.
And I have to say, I mean, I think Prachi is tired of me talking about it, but I was like, my mind was like buzzing. I was so excited about reading this. I'm like, did you read page 3? And like, okay. So in our episode 3, we talked about the intersection of mindfulness and the culture of innovation. And we, in fact, referenced your earlier work on the role of parasympathetic nervous system in allowing for this creativity and open thought. So now in this paper, I was introduced to this concept of renewal, which was fascinating. And you discuss the parasympathetic nervous system activation and allow that activation, allowing people to engage with new ideas, people, emotions, all of that. And you say how that enhances cognitive functioning from creativity to handling complex work. So can you discuss this linkage between neurochemistry and innovation?
Right. First, I mean, it's very clear that when a person changes in some sustainable way, they have moments of discovery. And that's what my intentional change theory has mapped out. But the thing that tips you from one to the other, or you might call it a trigger point, but it's really a tipping point technically, is this, what I call this positive emotional attractor state versus the negative. And the positive versus negative emotional attractor, if you actually plot it, has 3 axes. One is positive versus negative affect. Barb Fredrickson and others have studied a lot on that and done a lot more detailed work. I'll leave that. But one of them that I have studied since the 70s has been stress versus, and we used to think of lowering stress. We now it's very clear, as we pointed out in the article you're referencing, that when people talk about reducing stress, they're missing the point.
Mm.
Because even mild, annoying stress has these negative effects because it builds up. It doesn't stop. And just because it's mild doesn't mean you get over it. I mean, think about somebody cutting you off in traffic. Some part of you is steamed for a while, assuming you don't go into road rage and ram their car or pull your car gun out and shoot them or whatever. I am joking, of course.
Of course.
So, so the key, let me talk about the two dimensions. One is sympathetic, parasympathetic, and the other is analytic versus empathic neural networks. These are both parts of the human nervous system. The hormonal link, which is the parasympathetic, sympathetic, when you go into a stress response of any form, you activate the sympathetic nervous system. And this is crucial. We wouldn't be able to stay alive if we didn't have that. You need to wake up this morning. You're going to need it to decide what to have for dinner tonight. And in any piece of work, trying to figure something out, you're going to need it because you're focusing. But the sympathetic nervous system is stress. And if it's mild, like your cell phone drops a call, or it's major, like a pandemic or riots in the streets, then one of the things that happens is I'm not going to go through all the medical stuff because it's in the articles and other people have also described it. But basically, not only does your blood pressure go up and your breathing gets faster, but you actually, literally, your peripheral vision goes from about 180 degrees down to 30 degrees. And you lose the ability to be aware of what's going on around you. So, and that includes the natural environment. It includes competitors, marketplace. It includes other humans and feelings. So the very notion is that stress is impairment at the chronic levels that we get it. And this is pre-COVID. I mean, since COVID and all the social political disruptions we're facing in every city imaginable, I mean, we're off the charts these days. No wonder most people are leaving their jobs. They're in a desperate move to try to avoid something, but they haven't found what they're going to. And that's the part of the mental health crisis. It has been tragic, the millions of people who've lost their lives and their family members who mourn them through COVID. But this is nothing compared to the huge and long-legged mental health crisis that we're just beginning to see, because the pandemic exaggerated any neuroses anybody had. And then people all of a sudden started to wake up and realize they really thought their job sucked and like why should I stay? Anyway.
I mean, certainly I think couldn't agree more. The pandemic, changed that equation for a lot of people. It really provided that trigger to even start thinking about some of these things. And I mean, you had done all the research, but for us, I think, we understood it very peripherally, right? But the more we are into that thinking, so important to understand some of these connections.
As you, Prachi, and you, Kwan, for folks who have found some parts of this, I mean, I fell early in the pandemic, and I was working with a physical therapist, and she was deployed, as she said, to Boston Hope, which was the emergency hospital set up with 1,000 beds for the indigents and for the extreme cases, many of whom did die, sadly. And all of a sudden, she was going from being a physical therapist in an orthopedist's office, and the most stressful thing she would do is fitting a cast for somebody. and all of a sudden now she's working 12-hour days with people who are likely going to die. And I interviewed her with her permission about what she did, because she's a runner. She meditates, she does yoga. She immediately started to make sure that even virtually she and her friends got together on a regular basis. And then as soon as she returned after 6 weeks at Boston Hope, she returned to her regular practice, and people could start to ease up. She and good friends of hers, who were also either nurses or physicians, would meet outside and social distance at picnic tables, but just to see each other.
Right.
So I think a lot of these things that help contribute to what I think is the only thing to do to help counterbalance these ravages of chronic annoying stress, which is renewal. Now that's where the parasympathetic nervous system comes into play, because it's very clear that in the parasympathetic nervous system, people, as you said, Kwan, are cognitively at their best. They can handle the most complex things, they're most creative. They're perceptually at their best. They actually notice what's going on around them and what's going on with other people. People in the parasympathetic nervous system in that state are actually open to other humans and emotions. And their immune system functions at its best. So and they're able to have neurogenesis, which is the conversion of adult neural stem cells into new neurons. So there's a lot of things going on in the parasympathetic nervous system. And rather than continue to say that, because there's so many syllables, renewal, which is too long anyway, but nonetheless, it's easier to grasp.
Yeah.
So having talked about that without the language or the concepts in the 70s, it was exciting to watch over the decades, learning more and more about it. And that's when, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, Dan Goldman and I were working with a company, I don't want to mention the name of the company, but a very large high-tech company. And the CEO, very inspirational fellow, wanted us to help him with some new measures. And we said, sure. So, I had a bunch that I'd been using, and we retooled it, and they worked so well that on this one, I said to Dan, let's do the research right. So, because we had done a number of studies for them, I can't publish those because they're not under the University Ethics Board, IRB. So I filed for all the IRB thing. We did another series of studies, and that's in the Survive and Thrive article. One of the things it did was it helped us to be really clear that the more time you spend, any one of us spends in a given week, in these ordinary renewal activities versus ordinary stress. Too many stress researchers have studied acute. We wanted to study the ordinary. And this is pre-COVID, so it gets a little weird during COVID, but nonetheless. And what we basically found is that the more renewal episodes you have, in contrast to the stress episodes in a given week, really predicts your sense of well-being, your engagement at work, your career satisfaction, your empathy, empathy as seen by others, less depression, anxiety, more resilience. I mean, this whole set of really good things. Then something that I'd been saying back when I was doing the therapy with alcoholics is you have to stop drinking, but just don't stop drinking and start exercising 6 hours a day. I mean, today it's very shishi, but back in the 70s, anybody who exercised 6 hours a day was considered a fanatic. And that was my point, is you're trading addictions.
Right.
And they're both, it will end up being hurtful for you.
Right.
We now have the proof, because when we ran the statistics, the multivariate analysis, looking at the variety of things you did during a given week for renewal versus the variety of stress, it was just as predictive as the amount of time. So what we confirmed in this study is renewal activities really matter. One, and don't worry about reducing stress. You probably can't anyway. So think about increasing renewal. Two, there is nothing to say renewal has to take a long time. Matter of fact, physiologically, it's pretty clear that 15-minute bursts are more important than an hour. Even meditation. It's more important that you meditate 15 to 20 minutes several times a week than to meditate an hour. But the same thing around physical exercise, or laughing with your loved ones, or helping someone in distress, or taking a walk in the woods. These various things that have worked for men, women, every race, every culture imaginable. But the dosage, so the insight we have is focus on smaller doses and focus on a variety of things from the menu. So if people do that, we think incrementally, you're going to have a huge impact. I mean, so while the two of you have focused a lot on the mindfulness aspects, which is characteristic of a lot of the things you do by yourself, But I've been focusing a lot on the things you do with others. Helping people that are less fortunate in the community, helping the elderly. I tell my graduate students, helping your elderly professors will get you closer to heaven. Laughing with your friends, going for a walk in nature. All of these things that you're doing with others are very powerful.
What I've observed with my mindfulness practice is it has helped me to add on to those, like to engage more with others in those ways. So it's sort of like one thing has led to the other. Like I'm more open to just, to having those engagements with my friends. Yeah.
Right. I pretty much think of, my life as a combination of variety of experiences. That's how I sort of try to teach my son also. And one thing I have to say, you mentioned the keyword renewal, right? And the beauty of that from my, point of view is that allows us to essentially find our toolkit, right? It gives us a way to actually take certain actions, whether in small doses or medium doses.
And that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and make sure to keep an eye out for part 2. Also, a happy holidays from all of us here at the Spark Studios and the Samaya Studios. Make sure to check us out. Just search Samaya Studios or UAHI2C. We'll be happy to see you when you're there. Have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you in part 2. Onward and upward.